vapa derdim bulgaç yığlap demen sen bir vapa
Window to China Cable TV is so honored to have Norman Ornstein, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. We will discuss his New York Times Bestseller book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks.
Can you give us a very brief description of your new book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks?
So the book is called It's Even Worse Than It Looks because the American political system doesn't look good. It's not designed to. Democracies are noisy and difficult and cantankerous, and you're supposed to debate in a very fierce way different issues from different points of view. But in the last number of years, it's not just that it looks difficult, it's become more dysfunctional, much more. I've been in Washington for 45 years, and I've never seen it this dysfunctional. And as the book suggests, it's about how the American constitutional system collided with the new politics of extremism, which has changed the norms of the way people behave, but also resulted in a bad spell of trying to make policy.
Do you think the two parties should be responsible for this dysfunction or polarization in Congress?
As I say repeatedly in the book, there are no angels here. It's not as if anybody is all good or all bad. But the fact is the problems that we've had over the last decade plus really tilt heavily towards one party, and that's the Republican Party, which has itself become significantly more polarized and extreme than the Democratic Party. They've both moved apart, but also have a permanent campaign. Everybody focuses first on how you can gain political advantage, but are also peculiar to a kind of populism on the right that is more destructive of governance than what we see on the left. And it's also a reflection of a media that have become very tribal as well, with many more of those forces on the right than on the left. So nobody is a good guy here, but one party certainly, I believe, and my co-author believes, bears more of the responsibility.
You mentioned the political campaign, so especially the politicians who serve the House of Representatives, they have to re-elected, so every 2 years. Since they focus on raising money more than think about the policy, what do you think is the law and the regulations say about the campaign contributions?
What's happened here is so many things become intertwined. We went for a long period of time where there really wasn't a question about who would be in the majority. Now, every election, the majority can change hands. The pressure on the individual members to raise money for themselves, but also for their party, for their team. And now, in the aftermath of some very bad Supreme Court decisions, you can only raise money yourself in increments of about $2,600. You may have somebody come in the last 2 weeks of a campaign with a set of television commercials designed to viciously destroy you for millions, and you better stockpile money in advance for that. Spending more time raising money than governing is not a particularly good formula, but the kinds of things you have to do to raise money and the worries that many members have that the money will come in a primary campaign against them from an ideological side that tends to push especially Republicans further to the right or towards a more radical position. And the money phenomenon is a corrupting one. You have to raise a lot of money and you're a member of Congress. You go to people, and if they're reluctant to give you money, you may say to them, I've got power.
Yeah, what about the Supreme Court? So they saying its decisions to such as Citizens United. What's this about?
We've always had a struggle because the United States uniquely has this First Amendment protecting speech. And no speech is more protected than political speech. But the Supreme Court has moved from trying to make sure that you can have a voice in a campaign and that everybody should have a voice. At the same time, as the courts moved in that direction, Citizens United basically said that there should be no limits on what individuals or companies or entities can spend in a campaign if it's independent of those campaigns, that you can have some limits on contributions to but there's no corruption if it's independent. But subsequent decisions have shown that there's no such thing as independence. They're all very much intimately linked. We just had a story about how there's a vast campaign that's supposedly independent in Kentucky to benefit Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, who's in a difficult re-election race. The chief person making commercials and designing that campaign also is making commercials for Mitch McConnell directly. So how do you make that independent? The campaign money system now has become like what we used to call the Wild Wild West. There are no rules anymore, and that's not healthy.
Do you think that it should be changed?
I very much think it should be changed, and I am saddened that we had a set of reasonable, modest reforms in place that were pretty much destroyed by Citizens United, then by a decision called Speech Now, and then by a decision called McCutcheon. But realistically, nothing much is going to change until there's a different Supreme Court.
What are the seeds of this dysfunction in Congress?
Well, some of them go back 50 years or more, and some of them are more recent. When I first came to Washington, the two parties really were not as distinctly defined ideologically. Democrats had a very substantial share of their members who were rural, conservative, mainly from the South. Republicans had a significant number who were urban, liberal, or moderate from the Northeast and New England and also from the West Coast. But over time, we saw a very dramatic regional realignment. And in that realignment, the South went from being solidly Democratic and conservative to being solidly Republican and very conservative, although it's now showing some signs of moving again. And New England went from being home of moderate Republicans to being one of the most Democratic regions in the country, and the same with the West Coast. So our parties became more homogeneous and moved further apart. Then, with the 1994 election, Newt Gingrich brought his Republicans to power by nationalizing the election and degrading the reputation of Congress and tribalizing politics so that he could reach a point where voters would say, this is awful, anything would be better than this. That worked, but it ushered in a different era where the two parties saw each other more as the enemy than just adversaries. And the American political system only works when you can have alliances. And of course, we also saw the rise of the new media, cable television, talk radio, blogs, social media, all of which do best and can make money the best if they become more polarized and tribal in nature. Fox News, MSNBC, Rush Limbaugh, and the other talk radio hosts. And more people basically just now are in a world where you don't sit back and let the media talk to you. You go out and find the media you want to listen to or watch or hear or read. And that means for a lot of people it just is the same reinforcing messages with very different sets of facts that may or may not be facts. The parliamentary system has many features that are attractive. It's cleaner in a sense. Ours, because it was built around this gigantic country and these 13 colonies, was designed to spend a lot of time and effort bringing people together face to face to debate and deliberate and build some kind of consensus. The parliamentary system, you elect a government, there's an opposition, the opposition's role is to oppose everything that the government does. The government sets policy and enacts it, all the members vote together with it, just as all the opposition members vote together. And the public accepts in their culture that those decisions are legitimate, and if you don't like them, there'll be an election in 3 or 4 years, and you can throw them out, and if you do like it, you can keep them there. Now, that's cleaner, but it doesn't always bring better governance. If you look at what's happened since the global financial crisis, the United States, for all of its terrible dysfunction, has actually come out of it with some economic growth and a booming stock market and unemployment that's now going back towards the levels that we had before. And in Europe, the cleaner parliamentary systems kept making the same mistakes over and over again, and didn't have the capacity to rethink in many ways, so they're struggling. But having said that, there are parts of a parliamentary system that would be attractive, but you have to have a culture that supports it. Political system sets structures, and then over time, if it works at all, the culture begins to identify with that, because our parties are behaving like parliamentary parties. But in a system where you have a separately elected House and Senate and presidency, and you can have divided government, and where individual members don't always behave in the way that the system wants them to, that doesn't work. Parliamentary parties in a non-parliamentary system. But bring us a parliamentary system, and it would be a very long time before the party in the minority would accept the legitimacy of the decisions made by the majority. So there's no easy fix here like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any suggestions to fix that? Maybe one piece of advice?
Yes, the challenge is that it's less a problem with the structures of the American system than with the way the culture has changed and the way the media have changed. And that's harder to deal with, but you need to change some structures. One of the first places to turn is outside the institutions. It's the public. We have low voter turnout, particularly low voter turnout in midterm elections, even lower voter turnout in primary elections. And the ones who turn out tend to be the most extreme ideologically and the most partisan. So enlarging the electorate, making it easier for people to vote, moving away from a kind of cynical politics and campaigning driven by consultants, which is designed around scaring your own base so that they will turn out by convincing them that the other side is evil, and then suppressing the other side's base. If you had, as the Australians have, mandatory attendance at the polls, where you know both bases will be there, the incentive then is to...
Then it seems a lot of states like Texas, they put the more restrictions on the votes, people who can vote. What do you think that the problem connect with the, you mentioned the vote?
Yeah, what we're seeing now is that you have a Republican Party that has become more white and older and male in its orientation. Republicans have a problem with younger voters. They have a particular problem with minority voters, and that means Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and African Americans. They have a problem with women. They do much better with men. And until they can expand their appeals to some of those groups, because these are growing groups, and that Republican base of older white males is not expanding, they're going to have a hard time winning presidential elections or winning many elections in states. So you have two ways you can respond to that. One is you can change your policies and your rhetoric enough that it will matter to people. Your rhetoric in part because the anti-immigrant rhetoric is not just about an immigration bill. It's sending a signal to people that we don't really like your kind here, and that's a bad signal to send. But there are also policies, and that's a tough thing to do. So the alternative is to try and make sure that the votes of those rising groups, young people and minorities, are reduced in number by suppressing them. It's trying to make sure that the photo IDs that work are not available to some of the voters you don't want to be there. So in Texas, you can use as your photo identification to vote a concealed weapon permit, but a state-issued university identification card won't do. So students have a harder time. At the same time, it's not just about a photo ID to vote. It's about curtailing early voting and curtailing pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds so that they don't have to go through all the trouble when they turn 18 and can vote. It's all kinds of measures that are really designed to make it much harder for people to vote at a time when I believe we should be going in the opposite direction.
Window to China and Xinyu has reached out to the hundreds of Chinese community, Asian community, and American community on performance, interview in education, politics, culture, etc. It's a link for all the communities. Xinyu and Judy Wu, the publisher AC Business, are making joint efforts to promote the program on Newspaper Weekly. Window to China and Xinyu is a 30 minutes long English program. It will be available on YouTube, Facebook, Google+, AC Business News by keywords Window to China and Xinyu.
You could consider it blame on Republicans Party. So let's take an example, the debt limit crisis.
Yes.
How is people feel about that now? What is the result
Sure.
in 2011?
And, just for a little bit of background, the United States is one of very few countries that has a ceiling on its national debt. And you have to vote to raise it, or the country goes into default, in a sense. We've had that for about 100 years or so. And it's been used as a political weapon in the past. The party that holds the presidency says we have to increase our debt limit as we run deficits in spending. The party that's out of power says, well, we want to make a stand. We're being fiscally responsible. We don't want more of these deficits and more debt. But in the end, everybody understood that that was just a political tool, and you weren't going to jeopardize the full faith and credit of the United States. It's a change in our culture that Republicans, having lost the presidency and the Senate and the House in 2008, and then coming back and winning by a pretty narrow margin just the House, decided that they were going to use that leverage of being in the minority with 1/3 of the power here to take hostages and use it in effect for blackmail. And so it was, we will not raise the debt ceiling unless you give in to our demands, which included a balanced budget amendment and cuts in areas that the president wouldn't have liked, and tax cuts as well. And we came very close to having the debt limit breached. We were going to get a deal that the Speaker of the House and the President had worked out, but the partisans, the ideologues, wouldn't let it happen. So we created a super committee that was an attempt to try and force action by saying, if you don't reach an agreement to reduce future debt, then we're going to do mindless across-the-board cuts in areas of the budget that would be damaging to the country, believing that that would force them to act. The dysfunction was such that they didn't, mostly because Republicans would not take tax increases as part of a broader budget deal. And we ended up having these mindless budget cuts. They've been destructive. They only took effect for a short while before another budget deal delayed it for 2 years. But next year we get more of these, and that's one of the more worrisome things as we look to the future.
Wow, that's great to see. So what happened next?
Yeah.
Can I say that in 2011 that is accident? Both sides do not think that will happen. This happened.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, that's exactly
Okay.
it. Yes.
I think filibusters is rarely used in the politics before,
Yes.
but now it's more common. Why is that?
So the Senate from 1805 on had no way to stop debate if individuals took to the floor and kept talking and talking and talking, like action on things. But it was very rarely used, and the idea was that it's only going to be used by people when there's an issue of great national significance about which a minority feels so intensely that they will go to any length to block action that they don't like. It became most visible when it came to matters of civil rights and desegregation from the Southern members in the 1950s and 1960s. But after that, and after those filibusters were ended and we got civil rights legislation, it was a rarely used thing. Starting around 2006, we saw an increased use of the filibuster on a wider range of issues and used by both parties. The Democrats in the Senate used filibusters to block some of the appointments to the courts of President Bush, lifetime appointments, and Republicans used filibusters against Democrats after 2006, when Democrats were in the majority in the Senate and the president was a Republican, because the Democrats were intent on passing bills that would be embarrassing to the Republicans and the president, and they wanted to block the embarrassment. But then after Barack Obama got elected, we saw filibusters used on almost the widest range of bills and nominations, even those that ultimately were not controversial, that passed unanimously or near unanimously, because there was a realization on the part of the Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, that if you filibustered everything, the Senate is set up in such a way that it can take a week or even 2 weeks just to resolve one issue, and you are using up all of their time on the floor, making them look really bad and keeping them from being able to do some of the things that they wanted to do. And that's been a misuse of the culture, really. And the rules didn't change, but the norms did. And that led us to another unilateral change in modest ways in the filibuster rule to deal with nominations, but it's still a very potent weapon that's used way too much.
Does President Obama have any power to deal with that kind of situation?
The power that the president has, if Congress blocks action on things that he wants, is really to try and use executive authority where he can. And that's more limited, and it doesn't last usually beyond your time in the White House while laws continue. But you can have some very significant actions done through executive authority. And Republicans are very upset about this now out of the fear that Obama, because they refuse to bring up in the House or to deal in any way with a comprehensive immigration bill, that Obama will use his executive authority to stop deporting people and to give people green cards who otherwise wouldn't get them now, that he will use executive power to curtail greenhouse gases, to do something more on climate change. And there are many other areas. They will try to cut his funding for doing some of these things, but that's the direction we're going in very likely for the next couple of years. And of course, the president also has the ability to go to the country and try and shame Congress into acting. But for President Obama, with his approval rating so low, that's not going to work terribly well.
So not we only see the polarization in Congress, also we see the public is really similarly polarized. What do you think the public, the polarization contributes to the problems in Congress?
This started, I believe, at the level of Congress, and now it's moved down to many states, but also much more to the public as a whole. And so it wasn't caused by the public, but now it's reinforced very much. Now, what we know from the best surveys done by the Pew Research Center is that you still have about 2/3 of Americans who you wouldn't identify as being at the opposite ends of the spectrum. They're somewhere in a different place. They're not all in the middle. Some have a mix of conservative and liberal attitudes. But that means there's still a middle to go to. But these are people who are less engaged, less involved with politics. They don't vote as much. They don't contribute as much in campaigns, are becoming more polarized and more tribal in nature. Tribal meaning you view the other side as the enemy. And they're driving the political debate right now. They're the ones who turn out to vote in the primaries. the presidential primaries just up ahead, but also all the congressional primaries, they tend to dominate the fund-giving and fundraising process. And so the public's playing a more potent role now. And it's harder to change that because people get their news from the sources they're most comfortable with, and that news reflects what they want. There are a few hopeful signs out there in some of the states like Kansas and North Carolina, where a more confrontational style of governance, there's a bit of a backlash, and that may change things. But a lot of these fundamentals mean that we're going to be struggling for at least a few more years to try and get back to a point where we can be confident that the people we elect are going to focus first on solving the problems of the nation.
Thank you for providing the very truthful information. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey hey felek saldım beni cevri